The hunter swore he never packed it. But when he opened his bag deep in the Cheyenne woods, there it was, a rusted music box, still playing. No key, no batteries. Just that slow, broken lullaby, echoing through the trees. 16 years earlier, that same melody was the last thing heard before 3 children vanished without a trace. The case went cold. The song didn't. And now, it's playing again. The box was rusted shut when they found it wedged between bloodied canvas and a crushed thermos in the back of the hunter's rucksack. A nondescript piece of metal, unremarkable in shape or style, yet it was heavier than it should have been. Before we step deeper into the silence that swallowed Eli, Seth, and Clara Keller, the sheriff's children who vanished one October night, and whose lullaby somehow plays again after 16 years, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue digging through the forgotten, the unresolved, and the voices that still wait to be heard. It may seem like a small act, but it keeps these stories alive, and it reminds the darkness that someone is still watching. Thank you. Its edges were dulled by time, crusted with pine needles and the silent rot of the Wyoming wilds. But when the deputy touched it, something inside shifted. A mechanical whisper, a grind of gears. Then music. The sound came soft at first. A distant chime, as though it had traveled through fog and decades just to be heard. Notes plucked by a ghost's hand. Uneven, halting, but familiar to someone who'd buried the memory deep. The lullaby. They didn't know what it was not at first. The hunter, dazed and pale, said he didn't pack any music box, didn't own one, claimed he'd hiked into the Cheyenne forest alone, following a blood trail, hoping to salvage the meat from a downed elk. He said he never heard the song until the deputies unzipped his bag. That was when the trembling started. They dismissed it as trauma. The forest had played tricks on people before. Thin air, disorienting terrain, the kind of silence that screams when you listen too long. But someone at the station recognized the tune, though she couldn't remember from where. It gnawed at her, threading through her thoughts, sour and sweet like something once loved and lost. She kept humming it under her breath until the night shift turned hostile. That's when an old file clerk wandered by and stopped cold. "That tune," he said, pointing to the box like it was a viper. "That's from the Keller case." No one spoke. 1984. Sheriff's kids. The Triplets. They were playing it the day they vanished. The silence that followed was not disbelief. It was dread. The kind that slides under your ribs and settles, because deep down, you know it fits. The box, the music, the woods. The clerk unearthed the file, sealed and dust-choked, bound with a red tag. UN resolved. Do not disseminate. The photos inside were faded. 3 children, smiling too wide for the camera. A bedroom bathed in amber light. 3 small beds turned down, and on a dresser in the corner, a music box. Same rust, same shape, same chipped enamel flower curling around its lid. They had wound that box up once, 16 years ago, during the initial sweep of the house. The melody had been recorded as evidence, though it was never publicly released. Green sleeves slower, drawn out, in a minor key that didn't belong. Now it was playing again. The hunter sat in holding, head in hands. His boots were still caked with forest mud. He kept asking the same question. Why is it still playing? And no one had an answer. Because it had been 16 years since anyone touched that box. 16 years since the music had ended. And yet here it was, ticking like a heart not ready to die, singing the same sorrowful lullaby. In the hallway, the old sheriff's name echoed in whispers. Not Amos Keller, the lawman, Amos Keller, the father. The man who never spoke again after that October night. Who once said that the forest keeps what it loves. The melody played on. The wind that October carried the kind of cold that crept beneath coats and into bones. It came early that year, biting through Cheyenne streets like a whisper of something coming undone. Leaves blew in frantic spirals across the quiet yards of East Hillside, where every house looked like it had been built to hold secrets. At the corner of Willow and Hemlock, the Keller home sat still in the morning light, porch swing swaying, untouched cereal on the table, and 3 jackets still hanging by the door. Sheriff Amos Keller stood in the center of his living room, the radio clenched in his hand, his voice a breath above silence. "Dispatch," he said, though his voice cracked before the second word. "This is Keller. I need units. My kids are gone." There had never been a call like it in Cheyenne's history. A sheriff reporting his own children missing. Eli, Seth, and Clara. 8 years old. Triplets in age, but not in spirit. Clara, bold and sharp-eyed, always the first to speak. Eli, quiet and thoughtful, drawn to books and birds. Seth, the smallest, always laughing, always chasing shadows. They'd gone to bed the night before like any other. The sheriff remembered kissing their foreheads, the smell of cedar shampoo still clinging to their hair. Clara had asked if the wind was going to take their dreams again. He'd smiled, told her no, that dreams were safe inside the house. By dawn, the house was empty. The back door was unlocked, though neither he nor his wife remembered leaving it that way. There were no footprints, no signs of forced entry. The triplets' shoes were still by the door, their toothbrushes wet, their blankets tossed aside like they'd left in a hurry, or hadn't been in their beds at all. Deputies arrived in waves, boots stamping frost into the lawn. The search began within the hour. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to jackets, to pillowcases. They caught a scent and lost it within 3 yards of the porch. No trail, no direction. Like the children had evaporated into the air. Neighbors gathered at the property lines, murmuring prayers or theories, none of them brave enough to approach. They knew Amos Keller. They knew he kept order. But now, stripped of the badge in his voice, he was something else entirely, a father unraveling in front of them. By sundown, there were flyers being printed. Photos of the triplets at the fall fair, faces painted, eyes bright. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone felt it. This was not the kind of missing that leads to recovery. It was the kind that lingers, the kind that sinks in and stays. At 11:42 p.m., under a moon the color of old parchment, Amos returned to the house alone. He stepped inside, sat in the dark, and stared at the music box still resting on Clara's dresser. It hadn't played all day, not once, not until the exact moment the clock struck midnight. Then it began to turn, slowly, the gears catching on something unseen. The melody off-key, broken, filled the silence once more. Amos didn't move, didn't breathe. He listened to every note like it was a name being whispered from far away. Outside, the wind began to rise again. The Keller home sat like a frozen breath on that pale October morning, suspended in time, eerily preserved. To those who crossed the threshold, it felt less like entering a crime scene, and more like stepping into someone's dream mid-sentence. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. As though the house itself was holding something back. Deputy Harding was the first to walk through after Sheriff Keller made the call. He paused at the front door, noticing no damage, no forced entry. The latch was still intact, the hinges undisturbed. Even the welcome mat, an old stitched piece that read, "Come as you are," was perfectly aligned with the stoop. He knocked out of habit, then opened the door to a silence that did not welcome him. The living room was tidy, untouched. A thin layer of dust lined the shelf above the fireplace where family photos rested. Amos, the children, their late mother before the illness. No frames out of place, no signs of a break-in. A couch cushion bore the faint indentation of where a child had likely sat the night before. There was a pair of socks on the floor, bunched up like someone had taken them off in a hurry. But nothing about the scene suggested violence. There was no mess, no overturning of furniture, only absence. In the kitchen, 3 bowls of oatmeal sat cooling on the table, steam long gone. Spoons rested in them like silver boats adrift on a still pond. The cereal had hardened, clinging to the sides, uneaten. There were 3 juice glasses, half full. No spills, no smudged fingerprints, just stillness, like a breakfast that had waited for children who never arrived. Their rooms told the same story. Each child had their own corner of the second floor. Seth's was cluttered with comic books and dinosaur figurines, a sock monkey leaning against his pillow. His sheets were turned down, the pillow barely indented. Eli's space was more orderly, neatly stacked books, a globe with a missing continent decal, a drawing of an owl taped to the wall. Clara's room was soft, lavender and moonlight, filled with tiny horses and scribbled diary pages. On her dresser, the music box stood closed. Her bed, like the others, appeared undisturbed. 3 beds, all turned down, as if they had never been slept in, or as if someone had come and made them after the children left. But there were no signs anyone had, no extra footprints, no moved items, no mud. The carpets were clean. No smudges on the glass windows, no drag marks, no broken hinges, just the void. Technicians dusted for fingerprints, even though they all knew it would be fruitless. The only prints found belonged to the family, Amos, the children, none out of place. The back door was unlocked, but its knob showed no signs of tampering. Nothing forced, no tools, not even scratches. The latch had been slid open from the inside. Even the family dog, Ranger, had remained asleep through the night. No barking, no signs of agitation. The animal was found curled beneath the stairwell, tail thumping softly when approached. By dusk, after hours of combing every inch of the house, the investigators had nothing. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, no DNA, no noise. It was as though the children had simply stepped out of existence, plucked from their home, like threads removed from a tapestry, leaving no damage to the weave behind. Amos Keller stood in the hallway, his hand on the doorframe of Clara's room, staring into the emptiness. He didn't speak. He hadn't since the radio call. He just kept looking, as if the walls might confess something the air would not. Behind him, the last light of day slipped through the blinds, and somewhere in the silence of the house, a faint ticking sound returned almost imperceptible like a gear turning in the dark. He'd been tracking blood. The elk had bolted after the shot, wounded but not down, weaving erratically through dense pine and frostbitten brush. The hunter, Marcus Lane, 42, seasoned, quiet, the kind of man who didn't spook easy, had followed the Crimson Trail deep into a part of the Cheyenne forest he'd never intended to wander. It was colder there. The kind of cold that didn't seem to come from air, but from the ground itself. He didn't notice how the birds had stopped calling until the silence pressed against his ears like water. Even the wind felt like it had paused to listen. The trail veered sharply into a gully choked with fallen logs and overgrown vines. Marcus pushed through it, eyes scanning ahead for movement, bow lowered, breath slow. Then he saw it just ahead, past the tree line, in a sunless clearing that opened like a secret, a circle of stones. He hesitated. There was something wrong with how symmetrical it was. The rocks weren't placed by nature. They were arranged with care, 12 stones, smooth and pale, placed evenly apart in a ring about 10 feet across. At the center, nothing grew. No moss, no leaves, no needles. Just bare soil, too clean for the wild. Marcus stepped closer, boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. The scent of iron from the elk's trail had vanished. So had the trail itself. As if the animal had walked to the edge of that ring and been swallowed. He knelt. That's when he saw them. 3 small shoes. 2 brown leather, 1 pale blue. Different styles, different sizes. Children's shoes. Nestled into the earth, just beneath the surface, as though someone had carefully pressed them there decades ago, and the forest had chosen not to reclaim them. They were untouched by weather, no signs of rot, no bite from insects or mold. The laces were still looped neatly. One even had a tiny sticker on the tongue, a faded yellow star. Marcus stared at them for a long time. Something about them twisted his breath in his throat. He didn't reach out, didn't dig. Just stood up slowly and stepped backward until he was out of the circle. It wasn't until he was several yards away that he noticed the noise again. The ticking, rhythmic, faint. He turned nothing but trees, but the sound followed him, not like something in the woods, like something inside his pack. Back at camp, shaking, Marcus opened his bag and found the music box. He swore he had never seen it before. He hadn't touched anything in the clearing. But there it was, tucked beneath his extra flannel, metal dull with age. It played a melody the moment he moved it. No key, no wind. He didn't sleep that night. He packed up before dawn and hiked out of the forest in silence, glancing over his shoulder every hour. At the station, when he handed the box over to the deputies and told them what he'd seen, his hands trembled the entire time. They didn't believe the part about the shoes. Until they saw the photo. One blurry frame from a disposable camera. 12 stones. 3 shoes. And just barely visible in the corner of the frame 3 small depressions in the dirt, spaced like footsteps that ended too soon. The page was brittle around the edges, curled like old leaves, its corners burned to black. When the officer unfolded it, flakes of ash clung to his gloves. At first, it looked like any scrap of paper lost to the elements, a half-charred remnant from a campfire or a discarded notebook caught in the weather. But as the soot cleared, faint lines appeared. Handwriting, careful, looping, unmistakably a child's. It had been tucked inside the flap of Marcus Lane's hunting pack, wedged between a granola wrapper and a map of the backcountry. He insisted he'd never seen it before. Said it wasn't there when he packed the bag, nor when he'd pulled out his gear the morning of the hunt. But it was there when they checked, folded so precisely it seemed impossible it could have ended up there by accident. The ink had smudged, water-stained in places, but most of it remained legible. At the top, in childish script, were the words, "My Diary," followed by a date, the 17th of October 1984. It made the room go quiet. That date, one day after Clara Keller vanished. The entry was short, sparse, but haunting in its simplicity. "It's quiet here. No one talks, not even the trees. The lady says we can't leave yet. Seth wants to go home. Eli keeps drawing circles. I miss Ranger. I miss the light from the hallway. The food tastes like dirt, but I'm not hungry. The music keeps playing even when the box is closed." There was no signature, no goodbye. Just a single line at the bottom, centered, as though it had been written in deep concentration. The page was brittle with heat when the technician pulled it from the bottom seam of the hunter's pack, curled like a dead leaf. Its edges were blackened, the ink along the borders smudged and ghosted by what looked like smoke exposure. But the center of the page, the words remained intact, almost unnervingly so. Written in careful, slanted cursive, each letter looped with the delicate force of a child trying to write something important. At the top, the 17th of October 1984. 16 years too late. And one day after Clara Keller vanished from her home without a trace. The forensic analysts didn't speak at first. They examined the paper, turned it under light, ran every test they could find. The ink matched the type of pen Clara had used, one of those soft pastel ballpoints found scattered across her room back in '84. The paper was the same brand, part of a journal with a pink cover and silver latch, that had been taken into evidence, still half full. Her handwriting, too, matched. Confirmed against notes, spelling tests, birthday cards, a match, no doubt. But the page had never been found during the original investigation. Not among her belongings, not in the yard, not in the forest. Not until it surfaced, singed and folded, inside a hunter's gear bag that he swore he hadn't opened since spring. The words were simple, innocent, but not meaningless. The lady with the silver feet said we'd be safe if we stayed quiet. Seth cried a little. Eli is mad. I don't think she's mean. She sings to us. But she doesn't blink. That was all. No explanation. No location. No plea for help. Just a few lines scrawled in a child's handlines that seemed to shimmer with a kind of timeless fear. There were no references to a place, no sign of where they might have been, but the date, and the fact it existed at all, defied everything. For 16 years, Clara Keller had been missing, along with her brothers, all presumed dead. No sightings, no evidence, no bodies. The official report had remained unchanged. An unexplained disappearance, one of Cheyenne's coldest cases. But this page suggested something else, that she'd still been alive somewhere after the world had stopped looking. And in Cheyenne, when news of the diary fragment began to slip through the cracks of official silence, the town did what it always had. It lowered its voice. This was a town that did not like to ask questions it couldn't answer. When the Triplets vanished in 1984, neighbors lit candles but didn't knock on the sheriff's door. Church sermons lingered a little longer on hope and mystery, but never on justice. The children's classmates drew pictures and tied yellow ribbons to fences, but the ribbons turned gray with time and no one replaced them. People stopped speaking their names, as if saying them aloud might conjure some dark force that would take more. No one ever accused. No one ever speculated in public. Even when the search parties turned up nothing, when the national coverage moved on, when Amos Keller locked himself away and let his badge collect dust in a drawer still, the town prayed, quietly, like a whisper to a god that might punish them for speaking too loud. The years moved on, but the space left by the Keller children never closed. It just settled. Like ash in the corners of a room that no one dared sweep. Now, with one burned page, that silence trembled. Because if Clara had written those words, if she had been alive after the night she disappeared, then maybe everything the town had let itself forget was still out there, waiting. And the forest was listening. There was no ceremony when Amos Keller stopped wearing the badge. No resignation letter, no press conference, no firm handshake across the table. One day he was the sheriff of Laramie County, and the next, he wasn't. The department called it a leave of absence. The town called it mercy. But those who had known him, truly known him, understood what had happened. Something had broken in Amos Keller the day his children vanished, and whatever piece of him wore that badge had turned to dust with them. He kept the badge in the top drawer of his nightstand. Polished, unscratched, still gleaming beneath the soft yellow light of a dying bedside lamp. He never looked at it directly, but sometimes late at night he would open the drawer just wide enough to let the light touch it, like a priest lighting a candle in an empty cathedral. Amos had once been the kind of man who filled a room without trying. Broad-shouldered, measured, slow to anger, but slower to forgive. His voice on the radio used to calm tense deputies. He knew every back road in the county and every face in Cheyenne. People respected him not because he demanded it, but because he bore the weight of the town like it was his birthright. But after the 16th of October, 1984, Amos Keller became something else. Not bitter, not angry, just hollow. He stopped shaving. His meals came from cans. His hands trembled when he tried to hold a pen. He wouldn't answer the phone, wouldn't return messages. Deputies came by at first offering updates, shoulders, silence. Then they stopped. There were no updates to give, no leads to chase. Only the echo of a closed case left open for grief to fester inside. Neighbors began to see him by the mailbox each morning, wrapped in his old sheriff's coat, one boot unlaced. He would stand there for an hour, sometimes two, watching the horizon like he was expecting someone, waiting for a letter, a sign, a voice, anything. The mail came and went. Catalogs, bills, town circulars. But never what he was waiting for. He never said what that was, though some suspected. The week after the children disappeared, Amos had mailed a letter to an address no one could confirm. No return label. Just a line written across the back. If you ever make it out, tell me where the sky ends. He never spoke about the mother, either. Mary Keller had died the year before. Cancer, slow and cruel. Clara had brushed her mother's hair every day until the end. Seth had refused to say goodbye. Eli hadn't cried once. After her funeral, Amos packed up her dresses and never opened the closet again. It wasn't just loss that unmade Amos Keller. It was the quiet of not knowing. The steady ache of a question that stretched into years. What had happened? Where had they gone? Why no sound, no trace, no goodbye? Sometimes he would walk to the edge of the woods after dark and sit on a bench he built himself, back when he still believed things could be repaired. He would sit there until the stars came out, head tilted like he was listening to something far away. And once, just once, a hiker found him there in the early morning, whispering names into the stillness like prayers. Eli, Seth, Clara. Then silence again. Because a sheriff can chase leads, a father can only wait. The call came in on a Tuesday. Mid-morning. Static humming beneath the voice of a woman who sounded both certain and afraid. She introduced herself as Mara Ellings, a clairvoyant from Denver. Not a psychic by profession, she clarified, but gifted since childhood. And haunted ever since the broadcast on the local AM station had mentioned the Keller children's names again. It wasn't the news that triggered her. It was the melody. She said she'd heard it in a dream. She said it was coming from the trees. The deputies at the Cheyenne Sheriff's Department logged her call like they did all the others. By 1986, 2 years after the disappearance, the Keller case had become a magnet for delusion. Psychics, drifters, armchair sleuths, all clutching theories and hunches and impossible memories. But something about Mara Ellings lingered. It wasn't her certainty. It was the way she described what no one had ever seen outside of law enforcement files. 12 stones in a perfect circle. A ring of pale rock nestled into the earth. Surrounded by trees too tall to be natural, too symmetrical to be chance. She spoke of shoes, 3 pairs, small, resting at the center like offerings. She said the forest around the ring was not alive, not dead either, but suspended. Held in place by something she couldn't name. There's no time there, she whispered. Everything feels like waiting. The description matched a rough sketch buried in the original case file. A drawing by a neighbor boy. Theo Marshall, who'd claimed to have seen the children dancing in a ring in his dreams. It was never taken seriously. Theo was 6. The file had never been released publicly. Mara said she didn't want attention, she didn't want money, she just wanted to be heard. She had seen the children in her dream, standing at the edge of the circle. Clara's hair tangled with leaves. Eli holding something in his hand, a feather, maybe, or a key. Seth looking back over his shoulder, frightened. And standing behind them, a woman with silver feet. No face. Just a song. She doesn't blink, Mara had said. She watches, she sings to them when they try to leave. The investigator on duty that day, Deputy Lynn Morales, jotted it down out of habit, out of routine, but it stayed with her. Especially the part about the silver feet, an odd detail, impossible to fabricate, yet eerily similar to a line found in Clara's diary years later. The lady with the silver feet said we'd be safe if we stayed quiet. At the time, though, Mara's vision was dismissed like all the others. There was no evidence, no coordinates, no tangible lead. Just another woman from out of town dreaming about children she'd never met. The case was already considered cold. Reopening it for the sake of a dream wasn't something anyone wanted on their record. So they thanked her, took her number, filed the call, and never followed up. Mara returned to Denver, She never called again. But years later, when the hunter stumbled across the ring of stones exactly as she described, unmapped, untouched, and nearly buried by time, those who remembered her call felt something sink inside them. Not fear. Not guilt. Something worse. Recognition. The bathroom was small, just wide enough to fit a sink, a clawfoot tub, and a cabinet with a warped mirror that didn't quite close. In the days after the triplets vanished, forensic teams swept through every inch of that house, dusting, photographing, documenting, cataloging. They logged everything down to the fibers in the drain. But in the chaos of the investigation, one note in one report went unread for years. A simple line in a technician's inventory log, buried under timestamps and item codes: toothbrushes, 4 children's. It wasn't until the case was reopened in the year 2000, after the hunter's discovery, that a junior analyst named Doreen Petrowski found it. She was digitizing old evidence logs, scanning through faded typewritten pages with half an eye on detail and the other on coffee. At first, the number didn't register. Then she went back. 4. She pulled up the family file, cross-referenced birth certificates. Clara, Eli, Seth, 3 children. No mention of a fourth, no foster records, no adoption files. No cousin living with them, no explanation. She blinked at the screen, then she read it again. The toothbrushes had been collected, bagged, and photographed. And in that photograph, grainy, discolored by time, 4 brushes stood in a white ceramic cup, lined up like soldiers: red, blue, yellow, and green. 3 were marked with stickers the triplets had chosen themselves: a horse for Clara, a dinosaur for Seth, a feather for Eli. The 4th had no mark, just a faint strip of worn tape, where a label might have been peeled away. Doreen flagged it, forwarded the note to her supervisor, and received a non-committal reply. The prevailing assumption was that it must have been a spare, an extra. Kids go through toothbrushes, parents buy backups, but the case files were thorough, painfully so. And not once, in any of the interviews, did Amos or his late wife mention an extra child item. No spare shoes, no extra pillow, no 4th plate. Just that single toothbrush, never accounted for, never explained. When asked again, Amos's response was brief. There were 3, he said, his voice dull, his eyes refusing to rise. Clara, Eli, Seth, that's all. He didn't blink when they showed him the photo. He didn't deny it either, just stared for a long time and said nothing. But others remembered things, quiet things, half-thoughts. The neighbor, Mrs. Donnelly, recalled hearing the sound of 4 sets of footsteps on the wooden porch some nights. "I always thought you had a guest," she once told Amos, years ago, before he stopped taking visitors. Or maybe Clara had a friend over? Amos had stared at her, not with confusion, but something colder, and said nothing. A retired school nurse later mentioned that, in fall of '83, she'd seen Clara Keller walking through the hallway with another child in tow. A pale boy she didn't recognize, no name, no record. He never appeared on attendance sheets. They called him a shadow in the files, a smudge in memory. But the toothbrush was real, and it begged a question no one wanted to ask. Had there been someone else in that house? Someone who was never supposed to be counted, someone forgotten, hidden, or worse, deliberately left out. Not every haunting begins with who is missing. Sometimes, it starts with who was never supposed to be there. In the early spring of 1985, 6 months after the Keller children vanished, a boy named Theo Marshall stood on the sidewalk outside their house and pointed at the front steps. He was 7 years old then, red-cheeked and wild-haired, known for spinning stories about ghosts in the storm drains and fairies in his mother's garden. No one took him seriously. He told anyone who would listen that there was a secret space beneath the Keller's porch, a place only the children knew about. He said Clara used to crawl down there with her brothers, and they would disappear for hours, returning with dusty knees and whispered games that didn't make sense. He said they had a name for it: the hush room. When he mentioned it to Deputy Morales during a routine neighborhood sweep, she noted it politely and moved on. Children say strange things in the wake of tragedy, she told herself. Grief becomes play. Fear becomes fantasy. It wasn't even mentioned in the final report. But 15 years later, in the rustling quiet of a reopened case, Theo's words came back. In 2000, the Cheyenne Police Department was authorized to re-examine the Keller property with updated forensics equipment. The house had long since passed to new owners who had done their best to erase its history. New paint, new porch, new locks. But beneath the surface, some things remained untouched. The team brought in ground-penetrating radar to scan the surrounding lot. It was part formality, part desperation. No one expected to find anything. Not really. Then the machine pinged. Beneath the front steps, under layers of soil and concrete, it registered a void. Roughly 5 feet wide, 7 feet across, 2.5 feet tall, rectangular, hollow. A cavity with no architectural reason to exist. There were no blueprints to account for it. No mention in permits. No crawl space noted in the original foundation. It had been sealed over. Hidden. But it was there. When they finally broke ground, peeling back the boards and cutting into the concrete, they found a hatch, wooden, aged, sealed with rusted nails. It had been hammered shut from the outside. Inside, the air was stale and bitter, dry, like a breath held for too long. A single beam of sunlight pushed through the broken edge of a floorboard above, catching on the walls, where a child's drawing had been scrawled in marker faded rainbows, stars, something that looked like a door with no handle. A blanket, frayed and moth-eaten, lay crumpled in the corner. Candy wrappers, aged and brittle, still bore fragments of cartoon faces. And in the dirt, half buried, a plastic horse with one leg snapped off. The space was too small for adults, just enough for children to curl into, shoulder to shoulder. They never found bones. No clothing. No blood. Just the weight of something that had been hidden too long. When investigators showed Theo the photos, now in his early 20s, his face changed. Not with surprise, but a slow creeping recognition. He didn't remember saying those words as a boy, but when he looked at the hatch, he whispered without thinking, "That's where the quiet lives." They asked him what he meant. He didn't know. He just remembered that, sometimes, when he played too close to the Keller's porch, he could hear singing. Faint, distant, like someone humming beneath the floorboards. The forest had not changed, at least, not in ways the eye could see. The same winding trail through fir and ash, the same hush of pine needles underfoot. But when Marcus Lane returned to the place where he'd found the stone circle, something felt different. Or perhaps it was that nothing had changed at all. In the wilderness, time was meant to move. Leaves fell, moss crept, trees bent with wind. But here, it was as though time had held its breath and never exhaled. He found the clearing again without trouble. His boots remembered the path even when his mind faltered. And just beyond the rise, where the terrain flattened into that unnatural geometry, the circle waited for him 12 stones, still cold and still clean, despite 2 months of weather. But what drew his attention now wasn't the ring. It was the tree that stood just beyond it. It wasn't the tallest tree, nor the thickest, but it stood alone. A great pine, blackened and gnarled, with a trunk too wide for a man to wrap his arms around. Its bark was charred in places, like it had been struck by lightning long ago, though no surrounding trees bore similar wounds. But the strangest thing was not its damage. It was its silence. The air around it was dead. No birds flitted through its limbs. No squirrels chased bark to root. Not even insects dared to crawl along its base. The moss that blanketed most of the forest floor receded in a perfect ring around the trunk 3 feet wide, bare as if scraped clean. And there was no shadow. Marcus noticed it when the sun broke through the canopy above. Long shafts of light knifed across the glade, cutting through branches, casting shadows from every angle. Except one. The tree, this ancient, burned relic, cast no shape on the ground, no slant of shade, no distortion. Just an absence, like the light refused to acknowledge it. He took photos, hands trembling. He brought back soil samples, pinched in plastic evidence bags, and flagged the area for analysis. The technicians who ran the tests were confused. The soil beneath that tree was dry, too dry, devoid of the normal microbial life found in healthy forest earth. No fungi, no larvae, no organic breakdown. As if whatever once lived in that dirt had been erased, not by time, but by intention. The samples taken 2 feet outside the perimeter were normal. One technician, a geobiologist on loan from Laramie, said she'd only seen something like it once near the site of a shallow volcanic fissure in Iceland, where underground heat sterilized the land. But this? There was no heat, no gas, no sulfur, only silence. And the tree, which by all logic should have been long dead, was not. It stood firm, its limbs skeletal, unmoving, as if it had witnessed something long ago and refused to forget. Marcus didn't go near it. He couldn't. Not after he saw the faint markings carved into the trunk, 3 sets of initials, etched in a child's hand, crooked and tentative. C. K. E. K. S. K. Below them, one final mark. No letters. Just a symbol. A circle, drawn with a line through the center. When he looked away, he swore he could hear breathing. Not his. And not near, not far, but beneath. The cassette was found buried at the bottom of a long-forgotten evidence box, its label peeled halfway off and rewritten in someone's tired scrawl. Witness interview, the 20th of October 2084. Pause. Vandalism. It had been misfiled, lost in the shuffle of 100 dead ends, wedged between irrelevant reports and mold-spotted photographs. No one remembered recording it. No one remembered why it was kept. But it surfaced again during a routine audit in 2001, when a clerk digitizing old case files dusted off the plastic case and decided to listen. The tape was warped, the audio faint and riddled with static, the magnetic hiss rising and falling like breath. For the first few seconds, nothing. Then the scrape of a chair. A male voice, possibly Deputy Ramos, young and patient, asking a child to speak clearly. There's a pause, then a whisper. She had no shoes, the child says. The voice is soft, barely audible, strained by fear or fatigue or both. The microphone hisses, a rustle. The deputy asks, "Who are you talking about, sweetie? Who had no shoes?" "The lady," she was singing. "What lady?" Another pause, then a word that cuts through the fuzz like a blade. She sang like the box. At first, the voice seems unfamiliar. There's no name spoken on the tape. No file indicating who the child was. But when the audio team filters and amplifies the recording, the room turns cold. The cadence, the intonation, it matches archived birthday recordings from the Keller family. Home videos, one tape in particular, Clara, reading a poem at age 7. The whisper on the cassette is hers. A girl who, by all official accounts, had vanished 4 days before the recording was made. The room in which the tape was recorded can't be identified. The background is empty, save for a faint hum, possibly a fluorescent bulb or an old ventilation fan. But there's a moment, near the 2-minute mark, when the child says something else. Not a full sentence, just fragments, like a dream unraveling in speech. We walked a long time. Seth's feet were red. Eli tried to go back. She hummed the song so we wouldn't get scared. "What song?" the deputy asks. "The one from my box," Clara replies. She hums it wrong, slower, like it's sad. Then, silence. And finally, before the tape clicks off, one last whisper. She doesn't blink. The forensic team verifies the timeline again and again. The tape was recorded 4 days after the triplets disappeared, not before, not during, after. But Clara had not been seen since the morning of the 16th. No phone calls, no sightings, no ransom. Only this voice, her voice captured in a forgotten interview that no one remembered taking. The deputy named Ramos had died in 1,989 inches a car accident. His logbook from the day the tape was labeled is missing. Whoever sat across from Clara in that dim, unnamed room never filed the encounter. Never entered her into the system. Never said a word. The copy of the tape is placed in the reopened Keller file. Someone writes across its case in permanent ink, "Do not erase." Because Clara Keller may have been gone, but her voice never stopped speaking. The storm came fast, one of those sudden, late-season tempests that rose up from the horizon like a black wall and swallowed the sky. The 16th of October, 1984. Cheyenne was used to unpredictable weather, but that night was different. The clouds moved like they had purpose, rolling low and thick across the plains, dragging wind and dust in their wake. The air grew electric, humming with something more than just weather. As the sun vanished behind the churning dark, porch lights flickered, television screens blinked out, and the town braced for what it couldn't name. By 9:14 p.m., the first power lines went down. Transformers exploded in blue flashes across the northern ridge. Emergency services scrambled to respond. Dispatchers working by candlelight, their radios sputtering under the weight of interference. Rain slammed against windows and sheets. The wind howled like something alive. At 9:36 p.m., a call came through to 911. Static bled across the audio, swallowing the voice on the other end, but fragments pierced through the high pitch of a child's laughter, echoing unnaturally. And then another voice, younger, gasping mid-sentence. The operator asked the caller to repeat themselves, but the signal cracked apart like glass under pressure. Then, faintly, unmistakably, a scream. Not loud, not panicked, but sharp, short, like something startled in the dark. Then silence. The call disconnected before it could be traced. The number appeared unlisted. An address pinged, but not confirmed. The Keller residence. Deputies were already en route by then. Sheriff Amos Keller had made his call minutes earlier, voice tight, breathless. "They're gone," he'd said. "The kids, they're not here." By the time the squad car arrived, the house was still intact. No doors open, no windows broken. But the lights were out. The power had gone mid-dinner, Amos would later say. He'd lit candles, checked the fuse box. His children were upstairs when the wind picked up. That's when the lights went off. That's when he heard Clara singing. It was a lullaby one he'd heard countless times before. She often hummed it to Seth when he was scared. But there was something about the tone that night, the way it drifted down the stairs, that made the hairs on his arms rise. It didn't sound like a child comforting her brother. It sounded like someone remembering something ancient. When he called out to them, no one answered. He ran upstairs. The bedrooms were empty. The beds were still made. In the distance, lightning struck again and again, illuminating the tree line far beyond the backyard fence. For a moment, just a breath between flashes, Amos thought he saw 3 small figures standing at the edge of the woods, still, watching. He blinked. They were gone. In the days that followed, the storm would be remembered for the damage it left behind: downed trees, blown transformers, shattered windows. But for those who lived on Hemlock Lane, it would always be remembered for the moment time bent around a scream and left only silence in its wake. The 911 tape was archived and labeled inconclusive. But if you listen closely, beneath the static and the wind, just before the scream, you can hear a voice, barely there, whispering. She said to come with her. They found it tucked between the pages of a weathered field journal, buried beneath layers of dust and silence in the attic of Amos Keller's home. It wasn't addressed, not in any official way, just a name scribbled on the outside of the envelope in a trembling hand. Clara, wherever you are. The paper inside had yellowed, the ink faded in places, but the words had survived, pressed into the page with the pressure of a man who needed them to mean something. It wasn't a confession, not exactly, but it was close. No date, no return address. Just a voice, Amos's voice on the page, stripped of the uniform, stripped of the title. A father speaking in the dark to a daughter who had become more memory than flesh. I don't know if you'll ever read this, it began. I don't know if you're anywhere a letter can reach. But if the wind carries words, if time folds like they say it can, then maybe, one day, this will find you. He wrote about the quiet. The way it had settled into the house like a second skin after the three of them vanished. He described the mornings he spent staring at their cereal bowls, the exact angle the sunlight would catch the rim, how he would try to remember what their laughter sounded like and come up short. He admitted to things he had never told the department, things he had never told anyone. Your mother knew something was wrong, he wrote, long before October. It started with the drawings. He explained that, a few months before they disappeared, Clara had begun to draw symbols on the walls of her room. Not picture symbols, circles with lines through them, eyes without pupils, trees with roots like hands. At first, they thought it was just a phase. Then Seth started waking up screaming. Eli refused to go near the basement. And then Mary, their mother, began sleepwalking again. Something she hadn't done since childhood. She told me once, Amos continued, that she'd seen that symbol before. The one you drew on your window. She said it was in a book her grandmother kept locked in a cedar chest. A book full of stories from the old country. Stories they weren't supposed to tell. Mary had burned that book in the fireplace the night before she died. Amos had found the metal clasp in the ashes, warped and blackened. She never told him why. But the part of the letter that chilled most wasn't the confession. It was the question. Was it her, he wrote, the woman you saw? The one you used to speak to when you thought we weren't listening? Mary used to hum that song when she was scared. Not to soothe herself, but to keep something away. I didn't understand then, I do now. Amos never mailed the letter. Maybe because he didn't believe it would matter. Or maybe because, in some part of him, he thought sending it would make it real. That writing the truth down would give it weight, power. They found it after his death, sealed and forgotten, folded between notes about patrol routes and hunting seasons. As though the most important words he ever wrote were the ones he couldn't bear to say aloud. A letter never sent. A secret never told. And still, somewhere in that attic air, the faintest echo of a lullaby remained like paper remembering the hand that once held it. The new owners hadn't known much about the Keller house's past when they bought it. A bargain price, a quiet neighborhood, and the charm of an old Wyoming home nestled near the edge of town, it had seemed perfect for a couple expecting their first child. The agent had mentioned its history in the vague, evasive language of real estate, some local folklore, an old case, long closed. They'd nodded and smiled and signed the papers. It wasn't until they began stripping the wallpaper, in what had once been the children's playroom, that the past bled through the walls like a whisper. The paper peeled away in long, crumbling sheets, revealing something underneath, not just drywall, but markings. Faint at first. Then unmistakable. Drawn in colored pencil, faded and smudged by time, the lines formed a crude map. A child's hand had done it. The strokes were uneven, the shape simple, but the layout was clear. A house, a yard, a stretch of woods. Paths were traced in loops and zigzags, marked with stars and tiny arrows. There were labeled points: our tree, Clara's spot, Seth's hill, Eli's cave. And then, at the very center, encircled in thick red crayon, a perfect ring of stones. Next to it, written in shaky block letters, were 2 words: her garden. The renovators stopped everything. Photos were taken. The wall was preserved. And soon, the house was swarmed, not by painters, but by law enforcement, historians, and reporters with long memories. The Keller case had slept for years, buried beneath silence and grief, but now it breathed again through the crayon strokes of a child who had vanished before finishing 3rd grade. The map was studied, digitized, compared to regional topography. What shocked the analysts was how accurate it was. Though not to scale, the direction of the wooded paths aligned eerily well with the layout of the nearby forest. The location of the circle, based on the placement of the drawn landmarks, matched the coordinates of the stone formation Marcus Lane had stumbled upon in 2000. Clara had drawn it before she disappeared. Not guessed. Not imagined. Known. The phrase, her garden, sent shivers through those who remembered the diary page, the cassette recording, the whisper on the wind, the woman with no shoes, the song that didn't end, the circle that waited like a mouth frozen in a smile. It became clear, then, that the children hadn't simply wandered, they hadn't vanished in the night by accident, they had been led, or invited. The garden wasn't a place of flowers. It was a place of keeping. Further along the map, scrawled in a different color perhaps by another hand, was a trail that broke away from the others, a hidden path. Unlabeled, except for a small drawing at its end. A door with no knob, hovering beneath a tree. Investigators speculated endlessly. Was this some secret place they'd made up in their games? A fantasy world? Or was it real, buried somewhere deeper in the forest, waiting? No one knew. But the wall, untouched for over a decade, had held that secret in silence, as if the house itself had been waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to pull back the paper and reveal what the children had tried to leave behind. A warning. Or a memory. Drawn in red crayon. For her. Marcus Lane came back from the forest with eyes that didn't quite focus. He emerged from the trees just after dawn, boots caked in frost, his breath ragged though the air was still. He walked into the sheriff's station without a word, placed his hunting pack on the counter like it was made of glass, and asked if someone could take a look at his phone. Not his wounds, not his boots, not even the splintering ache behind his ribs, just the phone. He said he'd been gone for hours, maybe 4, maybe 5. He wasn't sure. The sun had dipped low, he'd felt the chill settle in, and the trees had grown strange. Sound didn't carry right. Every step echoed. He kept looking over his shoulder, convinced he'd hear twigs snapping behind him, but there was nothing. Just the wind, which didn't blow in any one direction. It surrounded him, pushed from all sides. But when he checked the time after stumbling back to the road, it didn't make sense. The watch on his wrist, which he had checked when entering the woods, read only 37 minutes later. His phone, still at 93% battery, showed a similar gap. The messages he'd expected from his wife, asking where he was, hadn't arrived. She hadn't even noticed him missing. He couldn't explain it. The hike in, the hours wandering, the stretch of forest that seemed to repeat itself over and over, the same crooked branch, the same knot in the tree trunk. He could have sworn he passed the same clearing 3 times. But the time never moved. The sun never shifted. It was only when he opened his camera roll that something broke in him. There, nestled between blurred photos of elk tracks and snapped branches, was an image he didn't remember taking. It had no timestamp, no GPS data. Just a grainy photograph soaked in blue-gray light, as if taken through fog or just before dawn. It showed 3 figures, small, distant, standing just beyond the edge of the stone circle. The silhouettes were unmistakably childlike. One taller, one shorter, one in between. They were not facing the camera. They stood with their backs turned, looking toward the tree line. Their arms hung at their sides. They were still. And behind them, half visible, stood a fourth figure. Not taller than the children, not smaller. Draped in something long and indistinct. The face, if there was one, was obscured by motion or shadow. The only detail that could be made out was at the feet, bare, pale, slightly lifted off the ground. Marcus didn't remember lifting the phone. Didn't remember pointing it. And yet there it was. Saved in his gallery, as though he had wanted to bring it home. He asked the deputy, almost in a whisper, if it was possible to take a photo of something not meant to be seen. Later, when forensics examined the metadata of the image, they confirmed what he feared most. The shutter had activated 37 minutes after Marcus entered the woods, and exactly 6 seconds after he claimed to have heard someone softly humming. Not an animal. Not a person. A lullaby, slow and broken. The kind that doesn't end. The kind you follow. It began with a school bus that arrived one child short. October 16, 2000. Exactly 16 years to the day since Clara, Eli, and Seth Keller disappeared without a trace. The driver hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. The children had boarded at their usual stops. The route was the same as it had been for years, winding through the edges of Cheyenne's east side before cutting across the southern tree line of the national forest. He remembered seeing Mason Wyatt, 8 years old, with his oversized backpack and mismatched gloves, get on at Hemlock Lane. Mason always sat near the back, drawing on napkins with a blue marker. Quiet boy. Soft-spoken. Kind. But when the bus pulled up to Cottonwood Elementary, Mason wasn't on it. At first, they assumed he had gotten off early, mistaken his stop, or simply wandered off. But then the teacher checked attendance. His parents were called. Panic followed. Search teams were dispatched within the hour. Dogs, drones, helicopters. The news spread fast, too fast. The town was ready this time, if not in body, then in memory. They remembered the Keller children. They remembered the silence. And they remembered the date. But this time, there were witnesses. 3 children, 2 from the bus, and 1 who'd been riding his bike near the forest's edge, spoke of something they weren't supposed to see. At first, the accounts were dismissed as echoes of the old story, kids repeating folklore. But their stories were consistent, too consistent. They all said they heard it. Singing. One girl, Sarah, said it came from the trees. Not from a speaker, not from another child, but from inside the woods. The melody was slow and sad. A woman's voice, quiet and far away, like it was wrapped in fog. She said Mason had turned to look out the window right before they arrived at the school. He'd leaned toward the glass, smiled. Then he was gone. No one saw him stand, no one saw him move. He was just missing. Another boy said he heard Mason whisper something before he vanished. "It's her garden now," he claimed, Mason said. "She's still waiting." The third child, the boy on the bicycle, had stopped near the forest when he heard what he thought was a music box. The tune made him dizzy. When he looked up, he saw a figure in white standing just beyond the tree line. Not tall, not short, face turned away, bare feet on the ground, a long dress moving with no wind. He said he blinked and she was gone. In the days that followed, Mason's drawing notebook was found near the base of an old pine tree, torn at the edges, damp from the soil. Inside were dozens of sketches in blue marker, trees, circles, shoes, a house with no windows, and always, somewhere on the page, a woman with long hair and no face, her mouth a simple circle, always open, always singing. The forest was searched, every inch. But the deeper they went, the quieter the dogs became, the colder the ground felt. One drone malfunctioned mid-flight. GPS signals faltered. Radios crackled with interference that no one could trace. And the stone circle, once flagged and mapped, had vanished. No stones. No clearing. Just trees, untouched, as if they had grown overnight. This time, there would be no silence. The town remembered. And for the first time in 16 years, the forest answered. They gathered at the tree line with candles in their hands and grief clinging to their coats. The sun had long since dipped behind the ridgeline, and dusk swallowed Cheyenne with the hush of reverence, like the town itself knew not to speak too loudly. October 16th had returned once again, and with it, the ache. It had been 16 years since the Keller children vanished. Now, Mason Wyatt's name joined theirs on whispered lips and trembling signs held up by mothers too tired to cry anymore. No one led the vigil. It didn't need leading. People simply arrived, a silent procession of neighbors, friends, strangers. Some had known Amos Keller before silence took him. Others had been in Clara's class, once, though they barely remembered her face. Some were just there because they couldn't bear the thought of a child taken without a sound. Again, the forest didn't move. The pines stood in their endless rows, casting long shadows that disappeared into themselves. The wind held its breath. Not even the crickets dared to break the stillness. They lit the candles and placed them at the edge of the woods. Some knelt. Some stood with arms crossed, jaws clenched. A few whispered prayers, soft enough that the syllables dissolved in the dark. Others hummed not songs they remembered, but something simple, something to fill the quiet. Some even tried to hum the lullaby, though none could carry the tune without faltering. The mayor said a few words, empty words, polished and practiced, meant to soothe and bind. They drifted over the heads of the gathered and fell flat at the forest's edge. And then, someone no one saw who placed a small, rusted music box on the ground. It looked like the one from the Keller case. Perhaps it was the one, perhaps another, drawn by the story's gravity. The wind turned the crank on its own, slow and soundless at first, and then notes. Uneven. Wounded. The melody faltered like it remembered too much. Each note rang out like a question without an answer. A woman wept into her scarf. A father pulled his daughter closer. Someone tried to record the moment, but their phone shut off dead battery, despite being full minutes earlier. The forest listened, or maybe it didn't. It was impossible to tell. When the song ended, no one clapped. No one moved. The music box sat still, its lid half open. The tiny ballerina inside frozen mid-turn. They left it there, like an offering, like a memory they could no longer carry. The crowd dispersed slowly, as if retreating from something too sacred, too haunted, to touch. One by one, the candles burned low. The last flame flickered out just after midnight. By morning, the music box was gone. No footprints. No drag marks. Only pine needles, damp with dew. And in the silence that followed, Cheyenne went on. Children laughed again in schoolyards. Leaves fell, radios played. But beneath it all, the weight of something unfinished clung to the town like fog. There were no answers, only echoes. And the pines, tall and still, remembering.